That was an amazing top 10. Now I would like to call to the stage Demba Ba, Gordon McCkay Professor of Electrical Engineering from Harvard University. Thank you very much, a warm welcome. And the moderator of this session is Vassilis Papakonstantinou, Partner and Head of Technology, Blue Dome Capital. So a warm welcome for both of them. Thank you.
Good evening. Sorry to disappoint the people that were expecting the singer to show up here.
Or the soccer player.
Yeah, or the football player.
Football player.
Yeah, so that's a very unique opportunity to see the other people. So it's a great pleasure to be here with Demba and discuss about the cross-disciplinary AI-driven innovation opportunities. We have, in part of our title, AI and X. And to be clear, this is not about the former Twitter platform. It's about all the other things that we can substitute for X and the kind of things we can do with AI. So a lot of discussion the past few days about neural networks and AI and machine learning. I'm not sure if people clearly understand how we train neural networks and how they work afterwards. Can you briefly give us a sense about the processes?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you all for taking the time to listen to us, especially this late in the afternoon. As Vassilis knows, I start every interview I give with the views expressed are my own, not those of my employer. And number two, I'm not a doctor, but I do not have any conflicts of interest to disclose. So, as you mentioned, we talk a lot about AI, and we don't really, at least users do not necessarily need to understand how they're trained or how they're worked, but we're going to give this a shot. So what a neural network is, I think everybody here, I'm assuming, has taken calculus. A neural network is basically a function. X, f of x, it's a function. Compute something. Let's say the temperature in a room. So, but it's a function that's interesting because it's a cascade of functions, and that cascade of functions is parameterized by what are known as weights. Because it's a cascade of function, the way it is trained is using an algorithm that is called backpropagation. So it's a cascade of function, and this algorithm called backpropagation goes back. So the analogy that I thought that would be very apt for this, so imagine climbing a hill. That's how you train the neural network, and having to measure at every point the steepness of the hill, right? That's called the gradient of a function. Now, a neural network is more interesting, but it's because it's like you're climbing a hill that's made of a bunch of other hills. So once you measure the steepness here, you also have to measure the steepness of all the small hills that are around you. So that's basically a brief summary of what's called the backpropagation algorithm. And if I might add one thing, I think one thing that's underappreciated with what people call the AI winter, or this AI revolution we're in now, is the infrastructure that has been built to be able to make training of neural network easy. So when we were all in primary school again, and parents are not going to like this because I'm going to tell this to your children. When we were in primary school, our teachers used to break our heads with computing the derivatives of functions. It turns out that you don't need to do this anymore. There's an algorithm called automatic differentiation that does this for you. So basically what I'm saying is that our kids don't need to learn calculus anymore. But
well, the kids in the room should discard this last statement because he got his PhD from MIT and he used all that stuff.
Yes, yes.
So but you can do that. You can discard them afterwards, like because all of us essentially discard these things when we go through this process, when we go out of the university into real life.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely.
So a lot of people also discuss about the huge amounts of data and the very specialized hardware and the very expensive energy that requires to train a model and run a model. There is a discussion about in Dublin, the data centers consuming about 21%, with respect to what happens to the entire city. How would you compare that with the real neurons which we use as models for the artificial neurons. How is the data consumption, the energy consumption? I'm not talking about the hardware. The hardware is very clear.
Sure. So I think numbers people have reported is that roughly your brain consumes about 20 watts of data, of power per day, an average human brain. And I think that's about 20% of the metabolic cost of the human body. I mean, what it costs to run this body is basically energy. Mitochondria, ATP, if you want to take it to that level. If you do a comparison, I think an efficient light bulb, LED light bulb, a modern one, probably burns about 10 watts in a given day. And a family household of 4 probably spends in a relatively well-to-do country, probably spends on the orders of tens or hundreds of kilowatts. A neural network, we don't know because a lot of these models are not open.
Yeah.
But in terms of what people are guessing based on the flops, the computations that are happening, we're talking about hundreds of megawatts to train something like a GPT-2. That's like this family household running energy on the orders of years, basically. So another distinction compared to this, so in addition to this low power consumption of the brain, another distinction between the way we compute using graphics processing units and digital computing, because one of the main distinctions is that computing in the brain is analog. The computing we do, von Neumann machines and etc., this is digital computing. So, and in digital computing, there's no idle mode. In the brain, there is an idle mode. Your neurons only consume power when they're firing. Otherwise, it takes very, very little energy to maintain what are called their membrane potentials. So overall, low power consumption, parallelism is another important part about processing in the brain.
Can you give us a sense about for instance, AlexNet or other algorithms that they became, the vision models that we see today? How many images they needed in order to understand, for instance, this is a cat compared to a human? What is the comparison in terms of our ability to learn?
This is a great point, and I think we're going to get to this in this discussion, human learning versus learning by machine. So he's referring to the fact that basically what we're calling this AI spring, because if it was winter before, it occurred in 2012 with a neural network that is called AlexNet. It was a neural network that was trained on 1 million images. ImageNet is what the data set is called, and it's a neural network that was able to tell apart up to 1,000 different categories. That's the number of classes roughly in ImageNet, I believe. I'm assuming many of you have kids or have had small kids. It probably doesn't take you that much data to help them learn that this is an apple or this is an orange and so on and so forth, right? So orders of magnitude, many orders of magnitude differences in the amount of data that are necessary.
We are talking about a few hundred instances versus millions of instances to get to the same level of understanding. So if you compare both, it is clear that human brain is more efficient. There's a lot of discussion, again, we had today about the pre-trained models, and especially after the advent of ChatGPT and all the other LLMs. What are, do we have a similar thing in the case of humans? Can we say that our human brains are kind of pre-trained, and what will be the kind of pre-training we get, and who does the pre-training, by the way?
We have young people in the audience. Can we probe?
Oh, okay. By the way, you can use the QR code to send us the questions. We will take them later on.
So his question is, pre-training in neural networks is this idea that you use a lot of data, like your ChatGPT uses the whole internet worth of data to understand language. And then if you want to develop an application like a medical GPT, you do what's called fine-tuning. You change the weight slightly for your particular purpose. He's asking, do we think that for humans there's something similar? And I want to ask the young people here if they want to throw any guesses. is there a sense in which when you're born, you come with knowledge or any courageous?
This is not a test.
This is not a test. Yes, young lady.
In my opinion, we do not come with innate information into the world, but as we collect, images, the time that we're nonverbal, as we collect sounds, as we observe people speaking, this is a way that gets your brain into training. And when we get to the mature age of having collected enough information, we're able to express ourselves slowly, better and better with more images that we collect. You become better at expressing yourself, at being in the world. So I think I can see a lot of similarities with existence and computing.
Great. What about, let's keep going with you, but what about our ancestors in the savannah in Africa, where I'm from, hundreds of millions of years ago? Do you think that experience is actually something that is preserved? Or they've learned things about the world to recognize certain predators that we also, a capability that we also have?
I think that it's a combination of existing and learning through existence, and also of genetics maybe.
Exactly.
I'm not exactly familiar with how genetics work, but I believe that there's also an innate sense. We do have, some instincts, human instincts, the way animals do have instincts. And some things are needs and bind us all as humans. From the ancient times, we had to fight for our food and go after it in the same way that now we do have to survive in the society. We had to socialize the way we still have to socialize. So I think it's a mix of genetics and of living and, collecting images, coming in contact with the world. But there's also something that connects us all humans from the ancient times and is in our genetics. That's my opinion, without, of course, having a lot of knowledge on the subject.
And that's the answer I was going for. Thank you. That's the answer I was going for. I think if we have biologists here, I think they will likely agree with me. This is proven scientifically that this is basically the field of epigenetics, right? So we come with some kind of genetic encoding of stimuli in the world that are kind of like the initialization of the network. And as she put it, also through a combination of learning in the world, you get some fine-tuning of the networks.
So there is a level of pre-training from nature.
Huge level, pre-training. So basically evolution, some people argue, is a form of, I'm going to get technical, it's a form of gradient descent without gradients. But it's just a very poor and slow form of learning.
Okay.
Yes. Over billions of years, yes.
Can the results of poor graded descent do better graded descent over the years?
If it's accumulated over many billions of years, and as she mentioned, if it's accumulated, it's not just my training, it's the training of the whole species, right? Or genes, if you want to put it that way, right? So yes.
So when LLMs came to the market a few years ago, everybody was excited by the fact that they could produce very nuanced content, sometimes exhibiting types of humor or other things that we would not expect as engineers to see. We know for a fact that these things are just word predictors, next word predictors, okay? So the question is, if you have two things that they can produce similar type of nuanced content, the LLMs and humans, and we know that the LLMs are just next word predictors, are we just overvalued next word predictors? What it is going on?
What separates us from? I mean that's a tough one, and It's very much subject to opinion. I think you're referring to this idea of what's called a stochastic parrot, or an LLM as a stochastic parrot.
Correct.
Or we basically parrots that are being replicated by a machine. We had a brief discussion about this before, right? So I thought that it was important to maybe get common ground on what we can call intelligence. So I have my own definition here, which I think is very accurate. So let's use this definition of intelligence, that intelligence is the ability to receive information, so collect information, synthesize it creatively, right? Not just receive that information, but be able to actually absorb it. And let's add something else here, to adaptively utilize it to achieve desired outcomes. Let's say that, if that is intelligence, right? Then your question boils down to, is something that has the ability to, that has intelligent behavior in the language domain.
Correct.
Can we say that that is something that basically mimics us? I would argue that the reason why I stated this definition is that when I say the ability to receive information, it encompasses things other than just language. It encompasses things such as the arts. It encompasses things that have a social dimension, like the young lady pointed out. Things such as mathematics. So things that arguably a machine that is only trained on things such as language. So language is a very, very poor domain to just express intelligence. There's this famous French politician from the Enlightenment. He had this famous quote, which is that language was actually, he thought that language, or his point of view was that language was created to obfuscate meaning, to actually hide meaning, right? So that's a form of counterintelligence, if you want to think about it that way. But to answer your question, what I would say is, if you look at these three categories, receive information, yes. An LLM is great at receiving the internet worth of language. Can they synthesize it or use it creatively? I think they can synthesize it, use it creatively. The jury is out on that. Can they adaptively utilize it to achieve desired outcomes? I don't necessarily think so.
Depends, of course, on the domain. Like, we have things that could do that, especially if you move to other domains where you have biology or other...
Exactly. But if we stick to the domain of language, I would say perhaps we can say that that's a form of intelligence, but I think that's a very, very narrow domain in which humans express intelligence. And there are a lot of domains in which I don't think AI is there yet, or is close to being there.
I get that point, but from the other side, like, if we simplify that AI is not as intelligent, the large language models are not as intelligent as, some of people in the market would want to say, and we humans do exactly the same process. We are just, telling the same things. The question is more if we are as intelligent as we want to be, or more like next word predictors that just,
So in the language domain, I would agree with you that yes, we're pretty much just next word predictors, right? So your LLM it learned somehow something about the semantic of language, about context, and so on and so forth, right? So in that sense, yes. But the argument that I'm trying to make here is that I think that is a very limited sense of thinking about intelligence.
Correct.
Does that make sense?
We were discussing this morning, Gal was talking about System 1 and System 2 thinking, and of course, the next word prediction is more akin to one of them. Then you need reasoning and other stuff, which we see emerging right now. But still, it is interesting to see something that how it works, and it's very simple in its work, competing, at least in a part of the domain. To me, it says more about the way we think of ourselves. And,
that's a great point. That's a great point. I mean, just to piggyback on that, of course, I teach students. So your large language model now is probably on the intelligence level of a PhD student. I mean, how does that make me feel as a teacher, right? So it makes me feel that, well, maybe I should rethink what it means to actually be intelligent. Does the fact that it can pass a test means that it's necessarily intelligent? Can it come up with new creative ideas? and so on and so forth. And that's when we get to reasoning models and some of these things that are appearing right now, right?
Yeah, and they're increasing dramatically. There is this interesting test aptly known as the last human test.
Yes.
And we see models scoring like single digits, and now we have OpenAI's 01 with deep research, or 03, you know, their naming sucks, to score 26. And they've done that, in the course of 2 years? So your PhD students, you know, you have to test them and see how they are coming up. The neural networks are constructs based on our real neurons, which obviously we don't exactly know how they work. We know enough, but not the same. And when we built the first airplanes, we got inspired by the birds, but we decided that because of physical constraints, it was not possible to have flapping wings, especially in the large.
Sure.
So we found another way around, which was not designed by evolution, or because we assumed that the birds were designed by evolution. So do you think that the artificial neural networks that we have today is the state of the art with which we will continue, which of course they are different from the way that are real neurons, or what is the sense that?
Yeah, that is a very, I mean, that's a question that has many layers. Let me start at the level of, do I believe that intelligence, what we think of human intelligence, that machine intelligence will necessarily look like that? And I don't personally think so, because of the parallel you've made with airplanes and birds, right? Mm-hmm. I think two things are important in that parallel. I think number one is, what is the goal of designing the machine? There's still a pilot flying the airplane, and my understanding is that a lot of the physics that goes into actually the airplane is not just the physical body, it's things such as, for example, enabling it to land by itself. What I mean to say here is that there are physical constraints, mm-hmm. and there's also a constraint that is determined by the task, by the goal of having the machine. So now if we come now to intelligence, right? If you ask me, well, first, I mean, we don't even need to go to machines, right? Your cat hears better than you. Your dog hears better than you. Your dog sees better than you. So what I'm suggesting here is that the machine, or whatever other biological entity, is likely going to be endowed with abilities to sense the world that we do not have.
And we do not need.
Well, I don't know if we don't need them, but let's say we do not have. Evolution has decided that we don't need them.
Okay, yeah,
okay?
That's what I'm saying.
And if they're endowed with a completely different sets of sensors, right, then what intelligence will look to them is going to depend on what their goals are going to be in the world, and what is actually going to enable them to survive based on an evolutionary process of their own.
Okay, so the task at hand will differentiate the way that
intelligence
will be designed, structured, and operate. And so maybe the term artificial intelligence it's bad semantics, because it just replies or make people to believe that mm-hmm. it will be something that it will replicate our own intelligence.
It's fair. I mean, humans tend to do that, right? To anthropomorphize technology, right? So it's a very common fallacy.
About a month ago, DeepSeek made headlines with in different ways. There were innovative things in there. We discussed that the most important part, or one of the most important parts, was their implementation of what we call the mixture of experts. So,
right.
Can you give us a sense what that means and how that relates to our real neurons?
Yes. I think this relates to part of the earlier question that I did not fully answer. So without getting too technical here, I'll just give a couple of examples. There's a part of your brain that's called your hippocampus, and it has things that are called hippocampal place cells. These are neurons that fire only when you're in certain places. So when you're at home, in your room, there's a set of neurons that only activate when you're there. Similarly, if you spend enough time here, if you're somebody that works here, there's a set of neurons that only activate here, and there's a set of neurons that activate at different parts of your path to here. Taxi drivers have a bigger hippocampus than any of us have. But I make this point to say that this is an example of the fact that neurons in the brain tend to be very, very specialized. So in your auditory system, for example, neurons in your cochlea are organized according to a spiral, where that spiral is a mapping of frequency, and you have different neurons along this spiral that fire for different frequencies. In your visual system, you have neurons that fire to things that are called gradings of different orientations. So that is not a principle that is actively typically used in training artificial neural networks. And what you're calling mixtures of experts are basically dedicated neurons or sets of neurons in DeepSeek that are dedicated to particular parts of a task. It sort of mimics this idea of specialization that we see in the brain. And I think it's a clever way to think about the future of how we build these artificial systems so that they're explainable or interpretable. The more specialization you can have in there, the more you're able to isolate different components of the network that are dedicated to specific things.
So essentially, if I got your answer right, the mixture of experts architecture says that you have this huge artificial brain, but there are groups inside there.
There's modularization, yes, it's modular.
That they have some kind of a specialization.
Yes.
And then you can combine these to get better results, better understanding, better auditability. We had this discussion between explainability and auditability, meaning the ability to understand how a decision came to be, or an inference. Do you think that, and also from your the first part of your answer, I understand that this architecture is more close to our brain, because our brain is not a mass of neurons. That there are places that they
in that sense, yes, in that
serve
sense of specialization, yes.
Yeah, and we know that there's plasticity, which means that if we lose eyesight, the part of the brain evolves.
Evolves, yes.
So do you think that the architecture of the neural networks, or the artificial neural networks, will try to take more advantage of the principles that we see in the humans in order to get more auditability, more efficiency, more energy, less energy consumption?
So people like me and a lot of people that are working on something that is called interpretability, mechanistic interpretability, understanding neural networks, that's the bet we're making. That by bringing more principles from how the brain computes, for example, the specialization of neural computing, that we'll be able to design better architectures, ones that are more understandable, and so on and so forth. But I think and this is what I'm betting on. This is the research that I'm doing, so I actually believe it. So I think there are economic forces at hand, though. So it took probably on the orders of hundreds of millions of dollars to train something like a GPT-2. Like hundreds of millions of dollars. That's a lot of money invested by companies to do this. And if I want to come all of a sudden and tell them that, look, I have this new fancy way of doing things better than you do, well, the first answer they're going to give me, why don't you go spend the $100 million and come back to me? So this is the challenge we're dealing with right now. And one way to deal with this is something that are called scaling laws. So you can show that as you increase the size of our networks to amounts of money that we can afford, we still see nice behavior. But there are economic questions at hand. A lot of money has been invested in the infrastructure we have now to train them. And people like us are saying, well, we need to rethink that. And hopefully.
So essentially, you mean that you don't want to cannibalize the existing infrastructure in order to build new one, unless you can redesign.
Without seeing tangible benefits.
Yeah.
So if anybody has 100 million euros to bet on researchers,
we'll find some. We have some interesting questions from the audience.
From the audience, great.
Anonymous, sorry about that. How can AI educational tools be designed to satisfy students' psychological needs as outlined in the self-determination theory? I'm not very familiar with the self-determination theory, but I guess as a professor.
If we have time, the person who asked this question can perhaps tell us, because I don't know what the self-determination theory is. They can probably tell us.
So who?
Or is the person online, maybe? I don't know.
Maybe.
Okay.
Is anybody here? No. Okay. Tasso says, which AI innovation would you like to see realized in the coming years? What do you think it would make the biggest impact?
Okay.
This is one of the axes that we are looking for.
This is great. Education. So I was talking to an expert on, and I care a lot about this because, as I've mentioned, I was born and raised in Africa. And the data don't lie. Childhood mortality significantly decreases by double digits based on years of education. Women health significantly increases based on increases in years of education. Electoral democracy. Wages increase tremendously with numbers of years of education. Why am I mentioning this? I'm mentioning this because I think we have an opportunity with these tools, large language models, in particular tools that are based on language, to democratize education. And what do I mean here? So this is science. There's something that's called Bloom's 2 sigma paradox. Look this up. This is very interesting. So this is the gains that a student gets from one-on-one education as opposed to education in a classroom, let's say, with 30 or 40 people. It's huge. It's like going from a student that's an average C to a student that scores an A. So imagine if instead of just having the teacher to interact within the classroom, your kid could actually interact with a AI that is designed with the right guardrails, of course, right? To receive that one-on-one instruction that they could not necessarily receive from the teacher. And I say this as a teacher. My AI is infinitely more patient than I am. I try, but my AI is infinitely more patient than I am, right? So for me, the biggest X is education. And because you asked me this question, and there's probably people from government here, I'm going to make plugs. I think when you start talking about education, you start talking about access. I don't know if this is a challenge in Greece. I'm assuming it is because there are a lot of rural areas. In Africa, this is a big challenge. There are a lot of rural areas where you do not have 5G internet access. So some of the technologies that are popping up are technologies, believe it or not, that are using old wireless technology and WhatsApp, right? So I think they're concrete questions that are related to access that one needs to think about based on the local context. And this was mentioned by somebody in the earlier panel, AI literacy. I mean, whether we like it or not, the box of Pandora is open. It's here.
That's true.
So one of the things we need to think about is literacy. So how do we make our societies AI literate? And I'm not just talking about teaching people, young people. I'm talking about throughout the lifetime. If my grandmother was still alive, I would love for her to learn how to use a ChatGPT for her purpose. Another challenge there is, so at least in Africa, or in the cultures that I come from, literacy does not mean writing. We have oral cultures. So when we think about access, we're not just talking about your LLM. We're talking about things that will necessarily need to be powered by voice.
Voice is a big thing. We had this discussion in the morning, and we have another session tomorrow. It's clear that X, in your mind, it is education, but you're a professor. How I've seen a lot of resistance from academia in general about the introduction of AI into the educational process, especially because it changes totally the way that you test the knowledge of people, the knowledge base of people. Like, you cannot give somebody an essay and expect that they will not use some. So how do you think that the educational process inside the class, whatever that class is, has to adapt in order to make the reality that you are talking about, as opposed to, fighting between teachers that they want and teachers that they block the use of AI?
Yes, I'll give you two answers. I'll give you the less thoughtful answer first, and then I'll give you the thoughtful answer. The less thoughtful answer is, I think this is just normal human fear that comes in whenever new technology is introduced. To me, I think of LLMs as being on the same trajectory as libraries, search. It's just an increase in the speed at which you can interact with knowledge. My students could already use search in very detrimental ways. They could already do that with libraries. They're still going to be able to do this using this technology. And again, I think as a teacher, if an LLM can answer questions you give to your students, you need to seriously rethink how you're teaching and whether you're actually teaching your students the right thing. So this is the less thoughtful answer. The more thoughtful answer is that I think the humanities and the sciences will probably need to deal with this differently. I can sort of see how if you're learning a discipline where the point is writing, right, there could be some anxiety around your students leveraging some machine in order to be able to write. I can understand that. And I think we can put the real guardrails around this. I think there are guardrails that can be put around this. Again, these interpretability tools, right? We could develop tools, robust tools, to detect whenever this happens, right? But in general, I don't believe in a punishment-driven educational system. If the students can learn in a particular way, I would love them to go that way. In the sciences, I think it's more challenging to use these tools in a way that's detrimental as a student.
Well, it depends again on the subject, and there are different subjects and different effects. Like if it's a language subject, it's a different thing. If it's a science subject, the thing could be different because you can have more opportunities. But nevertheless, I think the message is that we have to understand how these tools work and try to use them creatively, as opposed to try to stop them.
Sure.
It's a long discussion about education, and I think next year we should plan a separate session for AI in education. Thank you, Demba. Thank you all for staying with us.
Thank you.
I hope that you enjoyed the session.
Yeah, this was fun.